Working the graveyard shift at a remote toll booth on the Kansas Turnpike is an exercise in extreme isolation. For 24-year-old Thomas, the hours between 2 a.m. and 5 a.m. usually consisted of reading paperback novels and watching the occasional long-haul trucker pass through. His booth was situated on a desolate stretch of highway, miles away from the nearest town, surrounded by flat, empty fields. On a heavily fogged night in late October 2024, visibility was reduced to less than 20 feet. The heavy mist muted all sounds, making the silence inside the small glass booth feel suffocating. Around 3:15 a.m., Thomas heard the slow, crunching sound of tires on the gravel shoulder approaching his lane. He put his book down and slid the glass window open, expecting a tired driver digging for loose change. A dark green sedan slowly rolled into the illuminated area under the canopy. But as the car came to a complete stop right next to the booth, Thomas realized something was horribly wrong. There was no one in the driver's seat. The engine was completely turned off. The car hadn't driven up to the booth. It had been pushed in neutral. Thomas felt a cold sweat break out on his neck. He leaned slightly out the window to look into the back seat. It was empty. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling in the thick fog. There was no answer. He reached for the landline phone mounted on the wall to call the highway patrol, but the line was completely dead. Not just silent, the cord had been cleanly sliced from the outside of the booth. Suddenly, the trunk of the green sedan popped open with a loud metallic click. Thomas froze. Slowly, two men dressed in dark tactical gear stood up from behind the trunk of the car. They hadn't been inside the vehicle. They had been using it as a shield, pushing it through the fog to get close to the booth without being seen on the approach cameras. One of the men produced a heavy crowbar and immediately swung it at the reinforced glass of the toll booth door. The glass spiderwebbed but held. Thomas didn't hesitate. He slammed the emergency lockdown button, dropping the heavy steel security shutters over the windows, plunging the booth into darkness. For the next 45 minutes, Thomas sat on the floor in the pitch black, listening to the men violently beating on the steel shutters, trying to pry the door open. They never spoke a single word. When a convoy of semi-trucks finally rumbled down the highway, the loud horns scared the attackers away. Police later discovered the green sedan was stolen, but the men who pushed it out of the fog were never identified. Foreclosed properties often hold secrets, but a decaying farmhouse in rural Georgia held something far more sinister for a 32-year-old independent contractor named Arthur. In March 2025, Arthur purchased the abandoned property at a bank auction, planning to flip it for a profit. The house had sat empty for nearly 5 years and was situated at the end of a long, overgrown dirt road. On his third day of renovations, Arthur was working alone, tearing up the rotted floorboards in the master bedroom. The house had no electricity, so he relied on a heavy-duty battery-powered work light. As he pried up a large section of oak flooring near the closet, his crowbar hit something metallic. He cleared away the decades of dust and insulation to reveal a heavy, fireproof steel lockbox hidden between the floor joists. Assuming he had found an old safe, Arthur used an angle grinder to cut through the thick padlock. But when he opened the lid, there was no money, no jewelry, and no old documents. Instead, the box was filled to the brim with hundreds of keys. Arthur picked up a handful. Every single key had a small white cardboard tag attached to it with a piece of string. He held one up to the work light and read the neat, handwritten ink on the tag. It was an address. 442 Elm Street. Back door. He picked up another. 89 Oak Lane. Garage side entrance. A deep sense of dread washed over him. He realized this wasn't just a collection of keys. The previous owner of the farmhouse had been methodically collecting access to hundreds of homes in the surrounding counties. Arthur began digging frantically through the box, reading tag after tag, his heart pounding against his ribs. Near the bottom of the pile, he found a shiny, relatively new brass key. He flipped the tag over. Written in the exact same neat handwriting was Arthur's own home address, the address of the apartment he currently lived in 30 miles away. Below the address were the words, Arthur, lives alone, sleeps heavy. The implication hit him like a physical blow. The person who owned this house hadn't just abandoned it. They were still active, and they had been inside Arthur's home. Arthur dropped the box, grabbed his tools, and ran out of the house. He handed the entire lockbox over to the FBI. The investigation revealed that the keys matched dozens of unsolved burglary and stalking cases across the state over the last decade. The contractor immediately broke his lease and moved out of state, forever haunted by the thought of who was standing over his bed while he slept. The hum of a neon vacancy sign in the Nevada desert is usually a welcoming sight for weary travelers. But for 27-year-old Daniel, working the night desk at an isolated 12-room motel, it was a beacon that attracted the worst kinds of people. It was a quiet Tuesday in July. Only 3 of the 12 rooms were occupied, rooms 4, 7, and 9. At 1:30 a.m., an older man in a dusty trench coat walked into the lobby. He didn't have a car. He paid for room 12 in cash, signed the register with illegible handwriting, and took his key without saying a word. Daniel thought the man was strange, but in the desert motel business, strange was normal. He went back to watching the black and white security monitors behind the desk. About 20 minutes later, Daniel glanced at the screen showing the exterior walkway. The man from room 12 stepped out of his door. He wasn't carrying luggage. He was holding a large roll of silver duct tape and a heavy metal wrench. Daniel leaned closer to the monitor, feeling a knot form in his stomach. The man walked slowly past room 11 and room 10, completely ignoring them. He stopped in front of room 9, one of the occupied rooms. Daniel watched in horror as the man unrolled a long strip of duct tape and meticulously taped the door frame shut from the outside, sealing the occupants inside. He then moved to room 7, repeating the exact same process. Taping the door shut, ensuring no one could easily escape. Daniel's hand shook as he picked up the phone and dialed 911, whispering to the dispatcher that a man was trapping guests in their rooms. On the monitor, the man finished taping room 4. He now stood in the middle of the parking lot, holding the heavy wrench. He didn't try to break into the rooms. Instead, he slowly turned and looked directly up at the security camera. He pointed the wrench at the lens and then began walking purposefully toward the main lobby doors. Daniel dropped the phone, ran into the back office, and locked the solid steel security door just as he heard the glass of the front lobby shatter. He listened to the heavy boots pacing around the front desk, smashing the computer and the monitors. The man pounded on the steel office door for 10 agonizing minutes before the distant sound of police sirens echoed across the desert. The man fled into the dark expanse of the desert behind the motel before the cruisers arrived. When police unsealed the guests' doors, they found them terrified but unharmed. The motive remains unknown, but Daniel believes the man was preparing to start a fire, trapping everyone inside while he watched from the parking lot. Navigating an auto salvage yard during the day is difficult enough, but at night, the towering stacks of crushed cars turn into a claustrophobic, metallic maze. Marcus, a 30-year-old courier for a specialty auto parts company, was tasked with picking up a rare engine block from a massive junkyard in rural Texas. He arrived at 8:00 p.m., just as the sun was dipping below the horizon. The yard owner had left the main gate unlocked and told Marcus the engine was sitting outside the crusher in Sector 4. Marcus drove his cargo van deep into the yard, navigating the narrow dirt paths between walls of rusted cars stacked 4 high. He found the engine, loaded it into the back of his van, and got back into the driver's seat. It was completely dark now. He turned the key in the ignition. The van sputtered and died. The battery was completely dead. Cursing his luck, Marcus grabbed his flashlight and decided to walk back to the main office near the entrance to use the landline, since he had no cell service among the tons of scrap metal. As he walked down the dark, narrow aisles, the silence of the yard was broken by a sound. Clang. It sounded like a heavy piece of metal being dropped. It came from the aisle parallel to him. Marcus stopped and pointed his flashlight through the gaps in the crushed cars. "Hello? Is someone there?" he called out. No answer. Just the sound of slow, heavy footsteps crunching on broken glass, moving perfectly in sync with his own. When Marcus walked, the footsteps walked. When Marcus stopped, they stopped. Panic setting in, Marcus jogged toward the main gate. As the entrance came into view, his heart sank. The massive chain-link gate, which had been opened 20 minutes ago, was now pulled shut and secured with a heavy chain and padlock. He was locked inside. Suddenly, the floodlights atop the main office clicked on, blinding him. From the shadows beneath the lights, 3 men stepped out. They were holding baseball bats and lengths of lead pipe. They didn't say a word. They just started walking toward him. Marcus turned and bolted back into the maze of cars. It wasn't a robbery, it was a hunt. He squeezed between tight spaces, cutting his arms on rusted metal, desperately trying to lose them in the dark. He could hear them laughing and banging their pipes against the cars as they searched for him. With nowhere left to run, Marcus climbed into the trunk of a crushed 1990s sedan at the bottom of a stack and pulled the bent trunk lid shut. He lay in the suffocating, oil-smelling darkness for 6 hours, listening to the men actively hunting him, climbing over the very car he was hiding in. They only left when the morning sun began to rise. Marcus escaped over the fence at dawn, leaving his van behind, grateful to escape with his life. The Dalton Highway in Alaska is known as one of the most dangerous and isolated roads in America. For long-haul truckers like 45-year-old Richard, driving a heavily loaded 18-wheeler across frozen lakes and desolate tundras in the dead of winter is just part of the job. In January 2023, Richard was driving a load of supplies to a remote drilling camp. The temperature outside was 40 degrees below zero. If your truck breaks down out there, you can freeze to death in minutes. Around 2 a.m., Richard was navigating a particularly treacherous stretch of flat white ice miles away from any civilization. His headlights cut through the blowing snow, illuminating a sight that made him slam on his air brakes. Standing right in the middle of the frozen road was a figure. It was a woman wearing a thin, bright red parka. She had no hat, no gloves, and no vehicle anywhere in sight. She was just standing there, shivering, staring at his approaching truck. Richard's instincts as a human being told him to help her. No one could survive out here dressed like that. He brought the massive rig to a halt about 20 feet away from her. He left the engine running to keep the heater on, grabbed his heavy winter gear, and opened the cab door. "Hey, get in the truck before you freeze," he yelled over the howling wind. The woman didn't move toward the warmth of the cab. Instead, she slowly turned her head and looked into the dark tree line bordering the ice road. Richard's blood ran cold. He realized she wasn't stranded. She was bait. Before he could pull himself back into the cab, 4 men dressed in heavy white camouflage suits erupted from the snowbanks on either side of the road. They were holding rifles and moving fast. They were modern-day highwaymen, using the extreme weather and basic human empathy to ambush supply trucks. Richard slammed his door shut, locked it, and threw the truck into gear. The massive diesel engine roared as the tires spun, struggling to find traction on the slick ice. One of the men raised his rifle and fired. The bullet shattered the passenger side window, showering the cab in freezing glass. The temperature inside plummeted instantly. Richard kept his foot buried on the accelerator. The massive truck finally caught traction, barreling forward. He had to swerve violently to avoid hitting the woman in red, who simply stood there and watched him escape. He drove for 3 hours with a shattered window in sub-zero temperatures, suffering severe frostbite on his face and right arm before reaching a checkpoint. The authorities searched the area the next day, but found only tire tracks from a snowmobile leading deep into the uncharted wilderness.